Hello and welcome to this bite-sized webinar series from the Compliance People. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Hannah Williams and I am part of the consultancy team at the Compliance People. In this webinar, I will be going over the requirements of SECR, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. So in this webinar, I'm going to be covering the background to the scheme and its legal framework, who the scheme applies to, what information organisations have to report, and how that data is reported and how compliance is checked. SECR was brought into force in legislation on the 1st of April 2019, and that was done through the company's Directors Report and Limited Liability Partnerships Energy and Carbon Report Regulations 2018. For anybody listening to the webinar that has a LUS subscription to our Environmental Legal Register, you will find the 2018 regulations as an amendment to the Large and Medium-Sized Companies and Groups Account and Reports Regulations 2008, as this was how legally the SECR framework was brought into legislation by amending the 2008 regulations. What does SECR require companies to do? Basically, organisations have to report environmental information such as energy use in their annual reports. Whether you have to take part in SECR is dependent on the size of your organisation. So SECR applies to quoted companies, and these are companies that are officially listed on the stock exchange. You can find the full definition of what a quoted company is in the Companies Act 2006 if you need any more information. They apply to large companies, including charitable companies. I will cover the definition of what a large company is in the next slide. And they apply to large limited liability partnerships, known as LLPs. Organisations can be set up as an LLP where some or all of the partners have limited liabilities, which mean they're only responsible for their own issues rather than being responsible as a collective. So all of these companies, quoted, large and large LLPs, are required to report under SECR. And the key definition here is large. How do you know if your organisation is classed as large? Large companies have to meet two of the following criteria in both the current and the previous financial year. They have to have a turnover of more than 36 million. They have to have assets of more than 18 million. And they have to have more than 250 employees. So if your organisation meets two of those criteria, it will be classed as large. There are some organisations that SECR doesn't apply to. SECR doesn't apply to public bodies, although they may have other reporting requirements, such as under the greening government commitments. And it doesn't apply to companies that have been incorporated outside of the United Kingdom. This includes foreign parent companies of UK subsidiaries. However, the government does encourage all private sector organisations which aren't in scope of the legislation to still report like they would have to under SECR, although this obviously remains voluntary. So there may well be lots of you listening that are in an organisation that's part of a group. If you're reporting at a group level, you have to include the environmental information of your own and the information of any subsidiaries included in the group, which are either quoted companies, large companies, or large LLPs. You can therefore exclude subsidiaries that wouldn't be required to report on their own account. So if you had subsidiaries that aren't quoted, aren't large, or aren't a large LLP, you do not have to include their information. Note that this is a different approach than that taken under ESOS, Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, where a smaller subsidiary of a parent company is not exempt, even where on its own it would not meet the ESOS eligibility criteria. If you're reporting at a subsidiary level, it's well worth checking with the parent company in terms of what they're reporting for SECR and whether they're including your site's information as well. So what information actually has to be reported under SECR? What environmental information do we have to include? Note there's a key difference between quoted and unquoted large companies in terms of the environmental information that's required. For quoted companies, they have to report annual greenhouse gas emissions for all activities for which the company is responsible, including combustion of fuel and operation of any facility, and annual emissions from the purchase of electricity, heat, steam, or cooling by the company for its own use. They have to report underlying global energy use, last year's figures for energy use and greenhouse gas emissions as well. At least one intensity ratio has to be reported. Any energy efficiency action that might have been taken in that year needs to be reported, and the methodology used as well. For unquoted large companies, they have to report the following information, and that is UK energy use, and as a minimum it should be the gas and electricity use and for transport, and the associated greenhouse gas emissions of that energy use. As the same for quoted companies, they also have to report last year's figures for energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, at least one intensity ratio, any energy efficiency action taken, and the methodology used. So now on to some information about how to collate the required environmental data. First of all, you need to set the boundaries of your organisation. And if you own 100% of the assets you operate and have a simple organisational structure, then setting these boundaries should be relatively easy. However, for organisations with more complex structures, this could be more complicated. The government guidance document on SECR in Annex A provides more details of the approaches to setting organisational boundaries. So you should take a look at that if you've got a complicated organisational structure. You need to also determine the period for reporting data. It should be for 12 months and ideally correspond with your financial year, because this allows for easier comparison of your financial performance against other aspects of your performance. If the periods are different, the majority of your environmental reporting year should fall within the financial year, and it has to be made clear in the report that the annual period is not the same as the financial year covered by the report. You need to determine your key environmental impacts. Work out what environmental issues are important for your organisation, and this is dependent on the activities you carry out. Think about emissions to air, land, water, waste streams generated, materials and resource efficiency, and any biodiversity or ecosystems that might be applicable to your organisation. Government guidance suggests setting at least 3 KPIs, key performance indicators, associated with your key environmental impacts. You need to measure the data, and it needs to be collected and managed. Ideally, environmental reporting should be integrated into your existing reporting processes, and if you operate an environmental management system, an EMS, this can obviously facilitate the environmental data collection. If you've got lots of sites, using a standardised reporting format will ensure data received from the different sites and operations is comparable. And when reporting the data, you have to be as transparent as possible and state why and how you've collected the data and to which parts of the organisation the data relates. So a key thing to ask yourself is, what environmental data do you already collect? Rather than reinvent the wheel, how can you make use of this data to meet the reporting requirements for SECR? Make use of systems you already have in place. Were you part of the CRC Energy Efficiency Scheme, which is now obsolete? Are you part of ESOS? Or do you have a climate change agreement or part of EU ETS? Any of these schemes, you will be already collecting environmental data that's relevant to the scheme, which can be used as part of your SECR reporting. You may even be part of some voluntary environmental reporting frameworks, and you can duplicate the information from those as well. Note that you do still have to participate in SECR if you're part of ESOS or a climate change agreement. It's a separate legal requirement. So there are several exemptions in place for SECR. One of those is applicable if you're a low energy user. If you are a low energy user, You don't have to report the required environmental information in your reports, but you do have to state that it's not disclosed for that reason, i.e. you are a low energy user. Low energy users are quoted, unquoted large companies, or LLPs that have consumed 40 megawatt hours of energy or less in that year. And for reference, that amount of energy is equivalent to the energy use of around 40 households. So you would have to be using quite a considerably low amount of energy for the size of the company to be able to fall under this exemption. There are a couple of other exemptions. The legislation allows for the information to be excluded if reporting would be seriously prejudicial to the interests of the organisation. This can only be used in exceptional circumstances, and it's very likely it would be investigated by the Financial Reporting Council, so not something to be used lightly. It can also be excluded if it is not practical to obtain the relevant environmental information. Your report must state why this information is not included and why if you do use that exemption. Where does the environmental information have to be reported? It has to be included within the company's director's report or strategic report, and both of these reports are within the annual company reports that are filed with Companies House each financial year. If the strategic report is chosen by an organisation to where they want to include the SECR information, then you must include a statement in the director's report that it is within the strategic report where SECR information is held. Large LLPs have different filing obligations, so they have to prepare an energy and carbon report that has to be done for each financial year and include the SECR information required. It has to be approved by the members and signed on behalf of a designated member. The requirements apply to company reports for financial years starting on or after the 1st of April 2019. So if your organisation's financial year runs from April to March, then the first year of reporting will have been for the financial year from the 1st of April 2019 to the 31st of March 2020. And you don't have to report compliance into a regulator like you do for ESOS, for example. You just have to include the information in the relevant reports. With regards to verification of data, there's no requirement in the legislation for the data to be independently assured. However, it's recommended as best practice if that's something that the organisation feels it wants to do. And in terms of who enforces the regulations, that is the Conduct Committee of the Financial Reporting Council. They're responsible for monitoring compliance of company reports and accounts with the relevant reporting requirements, and this is through the Companies Act 2006. With regards to the reporting format that's required, there's no prescribed format set out in the legislation. Organisations should develop their own format to fit their business, also bearing in mind that the format should provide at least the minimum information requirements and allow for comparisons of data from previous years as that becomes available. The government have provided a reporting template in their general guidance document for SECR. It's strongly encouraged that you take a look at that template and certainly use it if you can. The title of the guidance is Environmental Reporting Guidelines, including Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Guidance. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. I want to thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful. And if you have any questions, please just get in contact with us at the email address that you can see on the slide. The Compliance People are the UK's leading provider of health, safety and environmental compliance management services, and we've got lots more guidance and resources available on our website, thecompliancepeople.co.uk. Thank you again for listening.